in the marble rotunda of the Harris County Courthouse. Beneath a vaulted ceiling built for vows and verdicts, Richard Owens pressed a fountain pen into his wife's hand. Board members stood nearby. A junior associate watched. 2 local reporters pretended not to. "Sign it, Courtney," he said softly, smiling for the room. "You've never really understood contracts anyway." It sounded civilized. It looked composed. It was neither. 7 hours earlier, in a different room under different lighting, Courtney Owens had signed something worth $45 billion. Richard did not know that yet. And when he finally did, it would be too late. If you believe dignity should never be mistaken for weakness, stay with this story until the end. Tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I want to know how far this story travels. And if you value quiet strength and lawful justice, consider subscribing. Some truths unfold slowly. This one is worth waiting for. Courtney Owens had once built her life on margins, not the decorative kind. The kind that lived in the edges of contracts, footnotes, subsections, cross-reference clauses most executives skimmed past on their way to the signature line. Before she became Mrs. Richard Owens, before charity galas and foundation luncheons, and the curated smiles of corporate life, she had worked in compliance for a mid-sized energy firm in Dallas. Her job had been simple in description and relentless in practice, find what others hoped would remain unnoticed. She was good at it. Courtney read slowly. She annotated with mechanical pencil. She cross-checked dates. She noticed when a version number skipped from 3.2 to 4.0 without explanation. She'd understood that what endangered companies was rarely what appeared in bold print. It was what hid in silence. Richard used to say that was what he admired about her. Back when admiration did not sound like acquisition. Richard Owens rose quickly in the energy sector because he understood optics better than oil futures. He was tall, composed, and spoke in clean, reassuring sentences. Investors trusted him. Boards relied on him. Reporters described him as measured and strategic. He had the kind of presence that translated well into headlines. Owens Energy Holdings had grown aggressively under his leadership. Acquisitions in shale, strategic partnerships, in renewables, calculated risk, layered beneath conservative language. To the public, Richard embodied responsible expansion. At home, he curated a similar image. Courtney learned early in the marriage that image was everything. At dinners, Richard would rest his hand at the small of her back, not possessively, not obviously, but firmly enough to guide her posture and timing. When she began answering a question too specifically, he would laugh lightly and reframe it. "What Courtney means," he would say, smiling at the table, "is that we're optimistic about the quarter." He did not correct her. He translated her. The first few times, she told herself it was partnership, efficiency, a shared public language. But gradually, the corrections became preemptive. He would answer before she spoke, or introduce her as brilliant with details but allergic to the spotlight. The room would chuckle, Courtney would smile, and later alone in the quiet of their kitchen, she would open a small leather-bound notebook and write the date. She did not write emotions. She wrote facts. March 14th, dinner with Whitman. Interrupted twice. Phrase used allergic to the spotlight. April 2nd fundraiser. Redirected answer, re-regulatory compliance. She did not know then that she was building a record. She only knew that memory was more fragile than ink. Their home in Houston sat in a gated enclave where privacy was marketed as a virtue. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced manicured landscaping. The interior was modern and restrained stone glass, carefully curated art. Nothing personal lingered in shared spaces. Richard preferred neutral walls. Clean lines suggest stability, he once told a visiting journalist. Courtney kept her personal items contained a bookshelf in her study, her notebook in the second drawer of her desk, password-protected folders on her laptop. She did not hide them. She simply did not display them. Richard's schedule ran the house. Conference calls before sunrise. Strategy meetings. Flights to D.C. He thrived on motion. Courtney moved differently. She observed. She tracked. She asked questions that did not always receive answers. When Owens Energy began pursuing a major expansion, rumors of a multi-state acquisition began circulating quietly. Richard grew more controlled. Not louder, sharper. He would pause longer before responding to her. His phone remained face down on the table. He began taking calls in his car instead of his office. He referred to board sensitivities when she asked about new subsidiaries, forming under unfamiliar names. "You don't need to worry about that," he told her one evening, loosening his tie, but not his composure. "It's layered structuring, standard practice." Courtney nodded. Then she opened her laptop after he went upstairs and searched the Delaware corporate registry. She found 2 new entities linked through holding structures. She wrote the names down. Richard did not think of Courtney as uninformed. He thought of her as contained. In his mind, he had protected her from volatility. The markets were ruthless. The press was unforgiving. He considered himself the shield. What he did not see was that shields can become barriers. The shift in their marriage did not arrive as a single fracture. It arrived as a recalibration. Invitations began listing Richard alone. Courtney's role at board dinners transitioned from insightful background to gracious presence. When she asked about returning to consulting work, even part-time, Richard responded gently. "Why would you want that stress? We're past that phase." Past that phase. As if her competence had been seasonal. Courtney did not argue. She rarely argued. Confrontation, she understood, often provided the other party with information. Silence revealed more. Instead, she watched. She noticed that Daniel Mercer, Owens Energy's chief legal officer, began attending more private dinners. That Thomas Blake from Horizon Capital appeared frequently in Richard's call logs when his phone lit briefly on the kitchen counter. That Olivia Grant from Corporate Communications began drafting press releases weeks before official announcements. Timing mattered. Courtney sensed acceleration. One afternoon, while organizing documents in Richard's home office at his request, because he claimed he was too swamped to manage paper, she noticed a folder labeled Simply Execution Draft Final. Inside were partial contract summaries, headings referencing multi-state grid expansion, a projected valuation figure that made her pause. $45,000,000,000,000. $45 billion. The number was contextual, embedded within broader projections, but it was not hypothetical. Courtney did not react outwardly. She closed the folder. She returned it exactly where she had found it. Then she went downstairs and wrote the date. She understood large deals. She understood that acquisitions required layers of authorization, compliance, sign-offs, financial disclosures. She also understood that timing could be manipulated. That evening, Richard was almost cheerful. He poured wine. He spoke about legacy, about positioning the company for the next decade. "History remembers bold moves," he said. Courtney studied his face. The confidence was polished, but beneath it was urgency. "Is everything structured cleanly?" she asked softly. Richard's smile thinned not visibly, but enough. "Of course," he replied. "We have the best counsel in the state." She did not press further. Later that night, as he slept, she opened her laptop again. She checked shared digital storage permissions. Several folders had been restricted recently. She noted the dates of access changes. She wrote them down. Courtney did not yet know that within days she would be handed documents under the label of routine authorization. She did not know that 7 hours before being humiliated in a courthouse rotunda, she would sign a page that altered the trajectory of multiple lives. But she felt the shift. It was in the way Richard stopped asking her opinion and began informing her of outcomes. In the way legal counsel addressed emails to him alone, copying her as courtesy rather than participant. In the way the house felt staged rather than lived in. Marriage, she understood, is also a contract. And contracts fail when disclosure fails. The tension between them did not erupt. It calcified. One night, after a board dinner at which Harold Whitman toasted Richard's unmatched strategic foresight, Courtney stood at the sink rinsing wine glasses. Richard lingered behind her. "You were quiet tonight," he observed. "I was listening," she replied. He rested his hand briefly on her shoulder. "Sometimes listening looks like absence." Courtney dried the glass carefully before setting it down. "Only to people who don't read carefully," she said. Richard did not respond. In the quiet that followed, something invisible but irreversible settled between them. Courtney did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She did not threaten. She opened her notebook, and she kept writing. The Houston Energy Forum was not a public conference despite its name. It was invitation only, held behind tinted glass in a private wing of the Post Oak Hotel, where security wore suits instead of uniforms. And conversations rarely reached microphones. Deals were not announced there. They were rehearsed. Courtney had not been scheduled to attend. Her name appeared on the printed program only as Spouse R. Owens, a placeholder, a courtesy badge. But at 8:12 that morning, as Richard adjusted his cufflinks in front of the suite's mirror, his phone vibrated with a message that altered the seating chart. Daniel Mercer. Running late? Blake pushing for immediate review. Need signature authority present. Richard read it twice. Courtney watched from the armchair near the window, legs crossed, a legal pad resting on her knee. She had brought it out of habit, not expectation. Richard's expression shifted, calculating, not alarmed. "They need an authorized signatory in the room," he said, already turning toward her. "Daniel's tied up in traffic." Courtney waited. "You'll sit in," he continued. "It's procedural. Symbolic. Symbolic." She stood, smoothing the crease of her navy dress. "What exactly will I be signing?" "Nothing final," Richard replied too quickly. "Just framework confirmations. They want momentum." Momentum, she knew, was often indistinguishable from pressure. The private conference room was windowless, insulated from distraction. A long mahogany table anchored the center. Bottled water aligned with geometric precision. Folders placed at each seat. Thomas Blake from Horizon Capital rose when they entered. He had the polished impatience of a man accustomed to shaping timelines. "Richard," he greeted. His gaze flicked to Courtney. "Mrs. Owens." "Courtney," she corrected gently. Daniel Mercer arrived minutes later, breath-controlled jacket immaculate, despite the supposed delay. Harold Whitman, chairman of the board, sat at the head of the table. He did not rise. His presence alone signaled gravity. Olivia Grant from Corporate Communications tapped quietly at her tablet, near the far end, drafting language before the deal was even complete. Courtney took the empty seat closest to Richard. Not at the head, not at the edge, centered. Blake began outlining valuation projections, multi-state grid acquisitions, renewable integration incentives, long-term federal infrastructure alignment. The numbers were large but plausible. The ambition was clear: $45 billion. Courtney did not interrupt. She listened to cadence instead of content, where Blake rushed, where Mercer paused, where Richard interjected with rehearsed certainty. When the draft documents were passed down the table, she did not open hers immediately. She watched the others first. Blake flipped confidently. Whitman scanned selectively. Richard turned directly to signature tabs. Only then did Courtney open the folder. Execution Draft Version 5.1. Her pencil hovered over the header. She noticed first the entity name listed in the acquisition structure. Owens Energy Holdings, yes, but layered beneath it a subsidiary she had not previously seen in finalized documentation. Blackridge Infrastructure Partners, LLC. She did not react. Instead, she turned to the appendix. Appendix C referenced financing arrangements routed through an external advisory firm. She traced the footnote marker back to a paragraph that felt newly inserted. The font size was consistent, but the spacing between lines differed slightly. Subtle. She circled nothing. She underlined nothing. She simply wrote on her legal pad, Blackridge IP confirm formation date. Blake leaned forward. "We're aligned on execution timing. Market conditions are optimal. Delays would signal hesitation." Richard nodded. "We're not hesitating. Courtney glanced at Daniel Mercer. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Blake said execution. "Before anything moves," she said quietly, her voice measured, "I'd like clarification on the Black Ridge subsidiary. Formation date and controlling interest." The room stilled not dramatically but noticeably. Blake smiled, thin and patient. Standard structuring vehicle. Clean for tax efficiency. "That wasn't my question," Courtney replied. Richard's knee shifted against hers under the table. Mercer adjusted his glasses. Black Ridge was formed last quarter, wholly owned through layered holding structures. It simplifies asset transfer. Courtney wrote, "Formed last quarter. Layered. Simplifies transfer." "An advisory compensation?" she asked. Olivia Grant looked up from her tablet. Blake's smile thinned further. "Competitive. Within norms." Richard interjected smoothly. "Courtney, this has all been vetted." She met his eyes calmly. "I'm sure it has." Silence again, short, contained. Whitman cleared his throat. "We need momentum." There it was again. Momentum. The word functioned as both strategy and warning. Courtney closed the folder gently. "Understood," she said. "But clarity sustains momentum." Richard's hand found hers briefly on the table's edge. To an observer, it looked supportive. To Courtney, it felt directive. The meeting continued for another hour. Financial models projected on the wall. Risk mitigation scenarios outlined. Regulatory timelines anticipated. Blake emphasized speed. Mercer emphasized compliance. Richard emphasized leadership. Courtney emphasized nothing. She observed. When updated signature pages were distributed for preliminary acknowledgement, non-binding confirmations of intent, she read each header carefully. She noted the document version numbers. She noticed that one page referenced version 5.1, while another footer still read 5.0. She wrote that down. When the pages reached her, Richard leaned slightly closer. "Just initial," he murmured. She did. Initialing was not execution. Yet. As the meeting adjourned, Blake shook Richard's hand firmly. "Announce within the week," he said. "We're aligned." Courtney gathered her legal pad before standing. In the hallway outside, Richard exhaled sharply. "That wasn't necessary," he said, voice low but controlled. "What wasn't?" she asked. "The interrogation. I asked 2 questions. You undermined confidence." Courtney regarded him steadily. Confidence built without clarity doesn't hold. He studied her for a long second, not angry, assessing. "You don't see the full picture," he said finally. "Then show me," she replied. He did not. Instead, he placed a hand at her back, guiding her toward the elevator as other executives filtered past. Inside the mirrored enclosure, their reflections multiplied 2 figures framed in glass and chrome. "You need to trust me," Richard said. Courtney watched their reflections instead of his face. "Trust requires disclosure," she answered quietly. The elevator doors opened. Outside, Olivia Grant was already drafting a press strategy timeline on her tablet. Blake was on his phone. Mercer lingered near the entrance, speaking in hushed tones to someone Courtney could not hear. She recognized the posture of contained urgency. As they stepped into the sunlight beyond the hotel's shaded overhang, Courtney felt the air shift. The deal was moving faster than it should, and she had just been placed in its center, not as architect, but as instrument. Richard opened the car door for her. "Let me handle the pressure," he said almost gently. "That's my role." Courtney slid into the passenger seat, smoothing her dress. "And mine?" she asked. Richard closed the door without answering. As the car pulled away from the curb, she opened her legal pad again. Under the notes from the meeting, she wrote one final line. "Momentum favors those who control the clock." She did not yet know how soon the clock would turn against him, but she sensed the mechanism tightening. And she kept writing. 7 hours before the rotunda. The morning began without ceremony. Courtney woke at 5:42 a.m. as she often did before the house adjusted itself to Richard's schedule. The air in their bedroom was still filtered controlled. She lay awake for several minutes, listening to the low hum of the climate system and the distant rhythmic sweep of irrigation outside. Beside her, Richard slept on his back, one arm bent at a careful angle, as if even in rest he avoided disorder. Courtney rose quietly. By 6:10 a.m., she was seated at the kitchen island with her laptop open and a mug of black coffee cooling beside her. The early light sharpened edges, revealing details the evening often softened. She reviewed emails that had arrived after midnight. One stood out. From Daniel Mercer, subject final execution packet, time sensitive. Sent 12:37 a.m. The body of the message was brief. Courtney attaching final execution copies. We'll need signature confirmation before noon to preserve closing window. Notary arranged. Routine step, Daniel routine. She opened the attachment. The file name included the word final in capital letters. Version 6.0. The document was larger than the previous drafts. Appendices fully integrated. Signature tabs marked clearly in yellow. Courtney did not open it immediately. Instead, she checked the metadata. Created 11:58 p.m., modified 12:21 a.m., author D. Mercer. She made a note on a separate sheet of paper V6. 0 created late. Modified 23 minutes later. Richard entered the kitchen at 6:23 a.m. Tie already draped around his collar. Morning, he said, leaning to kiss her temple. Morning, she replied. Daniel sent the final packet. He continued pouring himself coffee without asking if she had seen it. We need signatures before noon. Execution copies, she asked. Yes. He didn't hesitate. Standard closing timing. Courtney studied him. Why the rush market alignment, he said. If we miss today, we risk recalibration. Blake's people are ready. Momentum. She nodded slowly. Notary's coming at 10, he added. Daniel will be here. The housekeeper moved quietly in the background, polishing already clean surfaces. Courtney closed her laptop. I'll review it first, she said. Richard smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. It's already been reviewed. I know, she answered calmly. I'll review it again. He paused a fraction too long before replying. Fine. By 8:15 a.m., the dining room table had been converted into a temporary signing station. Leather folders stacked neatly, blue flags marking signature lines. A silver pen placed precisely atop the first page. Daniel Mercer arrived at 9:47 a.m., punctual in appearance, if not in timestamp. Courtney he greeted with professional warmth. Appreciate your flexibility. Of course, she replied. Richard joined them, moments later, jacket on phone. Silenced but visible. Daniel opened the primary folder. This is the consolidated execution copy, he explained. All schedules integrated. Board resolutions attached in Appendix H. Courtney turned to Appendix H first. She did not flip casually. She scanned deliberately. Board Resolution Owens, Energy Holdings. Date 3 days prior. Her pencil, which she had brought without comment, rested against the margin of her legal pad. Was this resolution unanimous, she asked. Daniel adjusted his glasses. Yes, recorded vote. Any abstentions? Richard exhaled lightly. Courtney, it's procedural, she said evenly. Daniel nodded. No abstentions. She wrote, no abstentions per Mercer. She moved to the financing schedules. Blackridge Infrastructure Partners. LLC appeared again, this time embedded formally within the acquisition structure. Controlling interest remains fully internal, she asked. Yes, Daniel replied quickly. Defined where Daniel leaned forward, flipping several pages. Section 4.3. Courtney located it. Section 4.3 described ownership layering, but did not explicitly name individual equity holders beyond the parent holding company. She made another note. 4.3 lacks named beneficial owners. Richard's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Courtney, he said quietly, this is closing documentation, not exploratory. She looked at him. I understand. The notary arrived at 10:02 a.m., a middle-aged woman named Cynthia Hale carrying a compact briefcase and an expression of practiced neutrality. Cynthia checked identification, verified names, confirmed awareness of the document's nature. Are you signing willingly? She asked Courtney. The question was standard. Required. Courtney met the notary's eyes. Yes, she said. It was true. Willingness and awareness were not the same. Daniel rotated the first signature page toward her. Sign and date here, he indicated. Courtney did not pick up the pen immediately. Instead, she compared the footer version number on the signature page with the main body of the document. Both read version 6.0. She flipped back to confirm. Consistent. She initialed the bottom of each prior page methodically as required. Her handwriting steady. No hesitation in the strokes. Richard signed after her on several sections. On others, he signed first. The stack diminished gradually. The air in the room felt compressed, not tense, but dense. When they reached the final execution page, Daniel spoke with quiet emphasis. This is the binding execution page for the acquisition agreement. Courtney looked at the header. Acquisition and Strategic Integration Agreement. Total valuation, $45. $0.000000045 billion. Printed plainly. She felt the weight of the number without dramatics. It did not overwhelm her. It clarified scale. Confirming signatory authority for Owens Energy Holdings, Daniel added. She glanced at Richard. You're certain this reflects the latest board-approved version? Yes, he said. Daniel nodded in agreement. Courtney studied their faces for a long second. Then she signed. Her name, Courtney Elaine Owens, curved cleanly across the line. Time 10:28 a.m. Cynthia Hale notarized the page, stamping it with deliberate precision. Daniel exhaled softly as though something fragile had been successfully carried across a narrow bridge. Congratulations, he said. Richard smiled broadly now. This is historic, he declared. Courtney closed the folder gently. Email me the final PDF with the audit trail, she said. Daniel blinked once. Of course. And the full appendix set. Certainly. Richard's hand rested on her shoulder again. It's done, he said. She looked at him calmly. Yes, she replied. It was done. At 10:46 a.m., Daniel departed with the physical originals secured in his case. Richard stepped outside to take a call, likely Blake. Courtney remained seated at the dining table for several minutes after the room emptied. She opened her notebook, 10:28 a.m., signed version 6.0, Notary Cynthia Hale, Section 4.3 Ambiguous Beneficial Ownership, Appendix H Unanimous per Mercer. She underlined the time. Then she opened her laptop and waited for Daniel's email. It arrived at 11:12 a.m. Attached was the fully executed PDF. Courtney downloaded it immediately. She checked the digital signature certificate embedded within the file. Verified timestamps. Her name appeared cleanly within the audit log. Signer Courtney E. Owens, timestamp 10/28/14, CST precise. She saved the file to an encrypted folder. Then, almost as an afterthought, she compared it to version 5.1 from the previous day's meeting. Side by side. There were differences, subtle but present. A paragraph in Section 4. 3 had been expanded. Language regarding advisory compensation clarified, but not publicly emphasized. Blackridge Infrastructure Partners' role slightly elevated in the integration schedule. She printed both versions, placed them in a slim folder, and wrote one final note beneath the earlier entry, differences between 5.1 and 6.0 review later. At 12:02 p.m., Richard returned inside, energized. Blake's thrilled, he said. Announcement within 48 hours. Courtney closed her notebook. Is there anything else you need signed today, she asked. Richard hesitated. Not today, he answered. 7 hours later, he would place a different set of papers in front of her. But at that moment, in the filtered midday light of their immaculate dining room, Richard believed control remained firmly in his hands. Courtney stood gathering the empty coffee cups. She moved slowly, precisely. The clock above the stove read 12:11 p.m. Momentum, she thought, does not erase paper. It only accelerates consequence. And she had signed. Richard did not bring the divorce papers home that night. He waited. Courtney noticed the waiting. The house moved through its routines, dinner prepared, and cleared lights dimmed to evening warmth. Security system armed. Richard took 2 calls in his study, voice low but steady. Courtney remained in the living room with a book open on her lap, though she did not turn the page. She sensed sequencing. Deals required timing. Announcements required choreography. Legal filings required alignment. So did exits. At 6:18 p.m. Richard stepped into the living room carrying a slim navy folder. Not thick, not theatrical, measured. "Can we talk?" he asked. Courtney marked her place in the book with a receipt and closed it carefully. "Of course." He sat opposite her rather than beside her. The distance was deliberate. "I've been thinking about us." He began the phrase shaped to sound reflective rather than strategic. Courtney folded her hands loosely in her lap. Richard continued, "The past few months have been strained. The word hovered between them, sanitized and vague. "I don't think it's healthy to prolong something that isn't aligned anymore," he said. Alignment. Another word from boardrooms repurposed for marriage. Courtney did not interrupt. "I've spoken with counsel," he added, sliding the navy folder onto the glass coffee table between them. "Patrick Doyle is handling it discreetly. We can keep this clean, private." The folder remained closed. Courtney looked at it without touching it. "Divorce?" she asked. "Yes," Richard replied. The word landed without echo. On the table, the folder's edge aligned precisely with the seam in the glass. Courtney reached forward and opened it. "Petition for dissolution of marriage. State of Texas. Petitioner Richard Owens. Irreconcilable differences." She read slowly. Each paragraph, each clause. Property division to be determined. Temporary restraining provisions regarding joint accounts. Non-disparagement language. Her pulse did not quicken. Her breathing remained even. "Effective immediately?" she asked. "We can file as soon as you sign acknowledgement," Richard said. "It's procedural." "Procedural?" She glanced up at him. "You already retained counsel?" "Yes." "When?" "A few weeks ago." Courtney nodded once. She did not ask why he had not mentioned it. Instead, she flipped to the financial disclosures, preliminary inventory and appraisement attached. She scanned the listed assets, primary residence vehicles, investment accounts, business interests. Some valuations were approximated, others marked to be supplemented. "Are these complete?" she asked. "They're preliminary," Richard replied. "Standard starting point." She turned another page. "Blackridge Infrastructure Partners isn't listed." Richard's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise, not alarm. Calculation. "That's corporate structuring," he said smoothly, "not marital property." Courtney held his gaze. "It's owned through Owens Energy Holdings." "Yes. And Owens Energy Holdings is partially community property." Richard leaned back. "You're conflating corporate and personal interests." "I'm asking for clarity," she said. Silence. He folded his hands. "We can litigate definitions if you want," he said quietly. "But I'd prefer not to. Litigate." The word carried weight now. Courtney closed the folder gently. "What is the urgency?" she asked. "There is an urgency," he replied too quickly. "Just resolution." She studied him. Today she pressed. "It simplifies optics," he admitted. There it was, optics. "The announcement will be public soon," he continued. "It's better if our personal matters are already in motion. It prevents speculation. So the timing aligns with the deal." Richard did not answer directly. He stood and walked toward the bar cart, pouring himself a small measure of bourbon. "You deserve independence," he said, as if offering generosity. "Financial security, privacy." Courtney remained seated. "I deserve full disclosure," she replied. He turned back toward her. "You'll have it through counsel. Why not through you?" The question lingered longer than the others had. Richard took a sip before answering. "Because this isn't about paperwork anymore." Courtney tilted her head slightly. "What is it?" He set the glass down. "It's about trajectory," he said. "I can't have friction right now." "Friction." Courtney absorbed the word. You consider me friction. He exhaled. I consider us misaligned. She rose, then moving to the window that overlooked the courtyard. Outside, the landscape lights illuminated sculpted hedges and stone pathways designed for symmetry. 7 hours ago, she said quietly, I signed a $45 billion acquisition agreement. Richard stiffened. And now you're asking me to sign dissolution papers? Yes, on the same day. Yes. She turned back toward him. That's not misalignment, she said calmly. That's sequencing. Richard's jaw tightened. You're overanalyzing. Courtney walked back to the table and reopened the folder. Patrick Doyle prepared this, she asked. Yes. Did Daniel Mercer review it? She made a mental note of that. Are there additional financial agreements attached? She continued. Courtney side agreements, indemnification clauses, advisory compensation structures that intersect with marital assets. Richard's voice hardened slightly. You're not in the boardroom. I was this morning. The air shifted. He moved closer to the table. This doesn't need to become adversarial. It already is, she replied. He placed both hands flat on the glass surface. Sign the acknowledgement, he said, voice low but firm. We'll handle the rest through counsel. Courtney looked down at the signature line. Acknowledgement of service, not agreement to terms. Simply acknowledgement. Her pen rested nearby silver, identical to the one she had used that morning. She did not pick it up. Why the non-disparagement clause, she asked. To protect reputations. Whose ours? She met his eyes. Or yours. Richard's expression cooled. This is exactly what I mean by friction. Courtney closed the folder again. I'll need a digital copy, she said. You have the paper. I want the full electronic filing. I'll have Patrick send it. Tonight. He hesitated. Fine. She slid the folder back toward him. I won't sign tonight. Richard's composure thinned. This doesn't have to be complicated. It already is, she said softly. He stared at her for several seconds. You're making a mistake. Courtney's expression did not change. Possibly, she replied. But not the one you think. Silence settled heavily between them. Final reads. Richard gathered the folder and walked toward his study. We'll discuss this again tomorrow, he said over his shoulder. Courtney remained standing in the living room long after he disappeared down the hallway. At 8:03 p.m., her phone vibrated. An email from Patrick Doyle. Subject, courtesy copy petition for dissolution. Attached was the full filing time stamped earlier that afternoon. Filed. Richard had not waited for her acknowledgement. She downloaded the PDF immediately, reviewed the filing time, 3:17 p.m., 3 hours after she had signed the acquisition agreement. She opened her notebook. 3:17 p.m., petition filed prior to acknowledgement. Timing aligns with execution morning, non-disparagement, unilateral tone. She underlined filed prior to acknowledgement. Then she compared the financial disclosures in the electronic filing with the printed copy Richard had shown her. There were differences, minor but present. One asset valuation adjusted downward. One advisory fee listed differently. She circled both discrepancies. In the study, she could hear Richard pacing softly while on the phone. His voice was calm, measured, optical. Courtney closed her laptop and stood. She walked to the hallway and paused outside the study door. She did not listen for content. She listened for cadence. Confidence layered over urgency. Momentum layered over concealment. She returned to her own desk instead, and she began organizing. Email folders created, documents labeled by version, timestamps logged precisely. She was not preparing for confrontation. She was preparing for process, because marriage, like acquisition, required disclosure. And Richard had just revealed more in his timing than he intended. Courtney did not cry, she did not shout. She wrote, and she waited. St. Mark's Civic Hall had been built in 1912, its limestone facade carved with modest flourishes that suggested permanence rather than extravagance. Inside, the vaulted ceilings carried sound in gentle arcs, amplifying applause and softening dissent. Charity events favored the space for that reason. It made generosity feel sacred. The Owens Energy Foundation had reserved it months earlier. By 6:40 p.m., donors filtered through the arched entrance beneath warm amber lighting. Crystal glasses chimed softly. A string quartet played near the east wall. Banners bearing the foundation's name framed the stage. Courtney stood near the registration table, navy dress immaculate posture composed. She wore no statement jewelry, only her wedding ring. Richard moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting board members and local officials by first name. Cameras flashed intermittently. A local news station had set up a small crew near the entrance to capture footage for the late broadcast. Momentum, Courtney thought, rarely slowed for ceremony. At 7:12 p.m., Richard approached her with a smile that suggested coordination rather than affection. "Can we step aside for a moment?" he asked. Courtney nodded. They moved toward a small alcove near the marble staircase, still visible from the main hall but slightly removed from the heaviest foot traffic. Patrick Doyle stood there already holding a slim leather portfolio. He offered a polite nod. "Mrs. Owens?" "Courtney," she corrected as she always did. Patrick extended the portfolio. "Just acknowledgement paperwork," he said evenly, "to formalize service." Around them, conversation continued uninterrupted. Laughter, glassware, the faint swell of music. Richard positioned himself slightly closer to Courtney than necessary. His hand settled at her elbow, not gripping but guiding. "It's straightforward," he said quietly. "Let's not create a scene." Courtney looked at the portfolio, then at the room beyond them. Board Chairman Harold Whitman stood across the hall speaking with 2 city council members. Olivia Grant hovered near the stage scanning the crowd for photo opportunities. A junior associate, Megan Ellis, watched from near the refreshments table, eyes attentive. The alcove was not private. It was strategically semi-public. Courtney opened the portfolio. Acknowledgement of service. Waiver of citation. Her signature line already marked with a small adhesive tab. Patrick held out a pen. Richard leaned closer. "Sign it, Courtney," he murmured. His tone remained gentle. "You've always preferred efficiency." She looked at him. "I prefer clarity," she replied. He smiled, public smile intact. "You're overthinking this." She turned a page. "Why the waiver of citation?" she asked. "It speeds up the process," Patrick said smoothly, "and limits my response time." Patrick did not answer directly. Richard's fingers tightened slightly at her elbow. "This isn't the place," he said softly. Courtney glanced toward the main hall again. 2 donors had begun watching their conversation, slowed by curiosity. Megan Ellis's gaze sharpened. Richard lowered his voice further. "Don't make this awkward." "Awkward?" Courtney closed the portfolio gently. "I'll review this with my own counsel," she said. Richard's smile remained, but his jaw stiffened. "You don't need separate counsel." "I disagree." The quartet transitioned into a softer piece. Applause drifted from the far side of the hall where a brief speech had concluded. Richard's composure shifted, not outwardly dramatic, but internally compressed. He adjusted his stance, positioning his body so that from a distance it looked protective rather than controlling. "Courtney," he said quietly, "sign it." Patrick extended the pen again. A camera flash went off nearby. The news crew had shifted angles, capturing candid interactions. Richard leaned in, his voice almost inaudible. "You don't understand the legal implications anyway." The words were soft, measured, but they carried weight. Courtney did not flinch. "I understand them precisely," she said. His fingers pressed more firmly into her arm. From across the room, Megan took one small step forward. Harold Whitman's conversation faltered as he noticed the cluster forming near the staircase. Richard sensed the attention. His smile broadened. He gently lifted Courtney's hand, guiding it toward the open portfolio. "Let's keep this civil," he said, projecting warmth. To an observer, it appeared conciliatory. Courtney felt the calculation in the gesture. Civil. The word hovered between them like a boundary. She looked down at the signature line, then up at the ceiling's vaulted beams, then back at Richard. 7 hours earlier, she had signed a $45 billion acquisition agreement that bore her name with precision. This line bore her name as well. But the context was different. She thought briefly of the notary's question that morning. "Are you signing willingly?" Here the question was unspoken. Her arm remained steady in Richard's grasp. Patrick shifted slightly, discomfort creeping beneath his professional mask. "Mrs. Courtney," he corrected himself. "It's procedural." She met his eyes. "Procedural for whom?" she asked. The murmur of the room grew subtly louder as more guests sensed tension. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Sign it," he said again, voice lower now, firmer. Courtney took the pen from Patrick's hand. She did not pull her arm away. She placed the pen against the paper, and she signed. Courtney Elaine Owens. Her handwriting remained steady. Richard exhaled quietly, relief masked as composure. Patrick gathered the papers quickly. "Thank you," he said. Courtney handed the pen back without expression. The moment dissolved almost as quickly as it had formed. Richard guided her back toward the main hall, arm still resting at her back. "To new beginnings," he said softly as they re-entered the crowd. Applause erupted near the stage as Richard was called forward to speak about the Foundation's latest community investment. He ascended the steps confidently. Courtney remained near the back of the room. From the podium, Richard spoke about leadership responsibility and building futures. His voice carried clearly beneath the vaulted ceiling. "Integrity," he said, "is the cornerstone of sustainable growth." The audience nodded. Courtney listened. Megan Ellis approached quietly. "Are you all right?" she asked in a low voice. "Yes," Courtney replied. Megan hesitated. "If you need copies of anything from tonight, I'll request them formally," Courtney said gently. Megan nodded, understanding more than was spoken. On stage, Richard concluded his speech to generous applause. Flashes illuminated his smile. Courtney glanced at the security camera mounted discreetly above the staircase. Its small red light blinked steadily. Recording. She made a mental note. When the event concluded and guests began filtering out into the warm Texas night, Richard found her near the exit. "That wasn't necessary," he said quietly. "What wasn't?" she asked. "The resistance." "I signed." "Yes," he admitted. They stood beneath the arched doorway as donors passed by, offering polite goodbyes. "You could have trusted me," he added. Courtney looked at him steadily. "I did," she said. He frowned slightly. "Then why the hesitation? Because timing reveals intention." Richard did not respond. Outside valet attendants moved efficiently. Engines started, doors closed. Courtney slipped her hand from Richard's arm. "I'll be riding separately," she said. He blinked. "We came together. I'd like a few minutes alone." He studied her face for signs of volatility. He found none. "Fine," he said. She walked toward the opposite end of the curb, where her car had already been brought forward. As she settled into the driver's seat, she looked once more at the illuminated facade of St. Mark's Civic Hall. Sacred spaces amplified sound, but they also captured it. Her phone vibrated in her purse. A message from an unknown number. "Megan Ellis? Security footage archived automatically. Let me know if you need timestamp reference." Courtney stared at the message for a long second. Then she placed her phone on the passenger seat and started the engine. She had signed, but she had not surrendered. And somewhere above the marble staircase, a camera had not blinked. Courtney did not confront Richard when she returned home from St. Mark's Arse. He arrived 40 minutes later, the scent of cologne and applause still clinging faintly to him. He moved through the house with the careful quiet of someone who believed a matter had been concluded. "It's done," he said simply, removing his jacket. Courtney stood at the kitchen counter laptop, open a glass of water untouched beside her. "Yes," she replied. Richard hesitated, as if waiting for emotion. When none came, he nodded once and disappeared into his study. The door closed. Courtney exhaled, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to steady focus. At 9:42 p.m., she opened her email archive. The Owens Energy server allowed her limited access, a courtesy extended years earlier when she occasionally assisted with compliance reviews. Richard had never revoked it. He had simply assumed she no longer used it. Assumption she knew was often more dangerous than oversight. She began with keywords: execution, Blackridge, timing, announcement. Hundreds of emails surfaced. She filtered by date range past 30 days. The volume narrowed. She scanned sender chains carefully. Daniel Mercer, Thomas Blake. Thomas Blake, Richard Owens. Patrick Doyle, Richard Owens. Daniel Mercer, Patrick Doyle. Her cursor paused. Daniel Mercer and Patrick Doyle. Corporate counsel and divorce attorney. Unusual. She opened the thread. Subject alignment. Daniel: we need to ensure execution and personal filings don't conflict. Patrick: understood. Timing will be coordinated to minimize exposure. Richard: keep it clean. Optics matter. Courtney read the thread twice. She did not react outwardly. She right-clicked and downloaded the entire exchange as a PDF. Then she checked the header metadata. Sent timestamps confirmed coordination. Execution scheduled for 10:30 a.m. Divorce petition filed at 3:17 p.m. Alignment. She opened another thread. Subject: beneficial interest. Clarification: Thomas Blake. Confirm advisory allocation via Blackridge remains separate from marital exposure. Daniel: structuring accommodates. Details not for broad circulation. Courtney leaned back slightly. Marital exposure. The phrasing was careful. She wrote in her notebook, Blake concerned remarital exposure. Advisory allocation through Blackridge. Structuring accommodates. She reopened the executed version 6.0 acquisition agreement and navigated to section 4.3 again. The language regarding beneficial ownership remained layered indirect. But in the email thread, the intent was clearer. Advisory allocation, separate from marital exposure. She opened the earlier version 5.1 draft she had printed. The paragraph referencing advisory compensation was shorter, less defined. Between version 5.1 and 6.0 language had expanded clarifying compensation structures without public emphasis. She should place the two PDFs side by side on her screen. There it was, an inserted clause. Compensation distribution via Blackridge Infrastructure Partners shall be governed by separate advisory agreement as outlined in Schedule 4.3b. Schedule 4.3b had not been attached to the board summary she reviewed. Courtney searched her downloaded version 6.0 for Schedule 4.3b. It existed, but it was marked Confidential Limited Circulation. She attempted to open it, access denied. She did not force entry. Instead, she returned to her email search bar. Schedule 4.3b. One result: from Daniel Mercer to Richard Owens. Attachment removed in this version. She clicked the earlier version. Attachment present. The file name read Advisory Compensation Addendum Draft. Courtney downloaded it immediately. Inside, she found explicit language regarding compensation to be distributed to a managing partner via Blackridge Infrastructure Partners. The managing partner was not named, but a footnote referenced executive discretion tied to performance benchmarks. Executive discretion. Her pen moved across the notebook. Executive discretion plus Blackridge plus marital exposure. She leaned forward, heart steady but sharper now. Another email surfaced. From Patrick Doyle to Richard, once filing complete compensation classified as post-separation income. The sentence sat plainly in black text. Courtney closed her eyes briefly. The timing was not incidental. It was structural. Richard had coordinated the execution of a $45 billion acquisition in the morning and filed for divorce that afternoon to reclassify forthcoming compensation as separate income. Momentum, optics, alignment. She did not cry. She did not feel rage. She felt confirmation. At 10:26 p.m., her phone buzzed. A new email from Daniel Mercer. Subject: audit trail confirmation. Attached was the DocuSign audit certificate for the executed agreement. Courtney opened it. Signer Courtney E. Owens, 10/28/14. CST signer Richard Owens, 10/31. 02 CST, the timestamps were precise. Below the certificate included IP address logs and authentication confirmations. Everything formal, everything clean. She downloaded the audit certificate. Then she opened a new folder on her desktop, Owens Chronology. Inside, she created subfolders: emails, contracts, audit, logs, financial. She moved each downloaded file carefully into its respective location. Then she returned to her inbox and searched one final term: Black Ridge Formation. An email from 3 months earlier surfaced. From Corporate Registry Services to Daniel Mercer, CC, Richard Owens. Subject: confirmation. Black Ridge Infrastructure Partners, LLC. Courtney opened the attachment. Certificate of Formation. Filed 2 weeks before initial acquisition talks began. Black Ridge had not been a reactive structure. It had been preemptive. She wrote, Black Ridge formed pre-negotiation, advisory allocation intentional, divorce filing post-execution to shield. Her phone vibrated again. A text from Megan Ellis, security footage archived under event ID 2207. Timestamp around 7:18 p.m. Courtney typed back, "Thank you." She did not elaborate. Instead, she logged into the Civic Hall's public event portal and submitted a formal request for archived footage under her name. Documentation. Always documentation. In the study down the hall, Richard's voice carried faintly through the closed door. Calm, controlled. He was speaking to someone likely Blake. "Everything's aligned," he said. "Clean separation." Courtney stared at her screen. Clean separation. Her cursor hovered over the email thread between Daniel and Patrick. She forwarded the entire chain to her personal encrypted email account. Subject line: Private Preserve. Then she printed hard copies. Paper did not depend on passwords. As the printer hummed quietly, she felt the mechanism of the day fully reveal itself. Morning secure signature on acquisition. Afternoon file for divorce. Evening secure acknowledgement publicly to appear civil. Future reclassify compensation. It was not impulsive. It was engineered. Courtney gathered the printed pages and placed them in a manila envelope. She labeled it in neat block letters: timeline, execution, filing. She paused, then added beneath it, intent. At 11:14 p.m., Richard emerged from his study. "You're still up?" he asked. "Yes." He glanced at the laptop screen, but did not approach. "Don't stay up too late," he said. Courtney closed her notebook. "I won't." He studied her face briefly, searching for volatility. Finding none, he nodded and walked upstairs. When the house fell silent again, Courtney reopened her laptop one final time. She drafted a short email. To Eleanor Park, subject: consultation request. Miss Park, I need counsel regarding coordinated execution of a corporate transaction and marital filing. Timeline and documentation available. Courtney Owens. She did not attach anything. Not yet. She scheduled the email to send at 6:00 a.m. Timing mattered. She shut down her laptop and turned off the kitchen light. Upstairs, Richard slept under the assumption that the sequence had protected him. Downstairs, beneath the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint glow of standby electronics, Courtney had built a record. Momentum favored those who controlled the clock, but evidence favored those who preserved it. And Courtney had begun preserving everything. The bank did not care about optics. It did not respond to applause, nor did it soften language for reputations. It recorded debits and credits with indifferent precision. It time-stamped movement without commentary. It did not interpret intent. It simply preserved it. Courtney logged into the joint account portal at 6:12 a.m., 15 minutes after her scheduled email to Eleanor Park had sent. Richard was still asleep upstairs. The Owens household maintained multiple accounts: primary checking, investment portfolios, a charitable foundation disbursement account. Courtney had access to most of them. Years ago, Richard had insisted on transparency. He had meant symbolic transparency, not forensic. She began with a primary operating account. The balance was substantial, stable. She filtered transactions from the past 60 days. Her eyes moved slowly across line items: mortgage, utilities, foundation donations, routine expenses, Then 3 entries in closer succession. Doyle Legal Group, retainer $125, 000 Blackridge Consulting Services, advisory fee $2, 400,000 Blackridge Consulting Services, performance allocation $3, 800,000. Courtney did not react physically. She adjusted the filter to display transaction details. The Doyle Legal Group retainer had cleared 2 days before the execution of the acquisition agreement. The Blackridge payments had cleared the morning after. She checked the memo fields. Advisory services rendered. No further description. She clicked into the Blackridge Consulting Services vendor profile. The registered address matched that of Blackridge Infrastructure Partners, LLC. She wrote in her notebook, retainer pre-execution, Blackridge payouts, post-execution, joint funds used pre-filing. The distinction mattered. If the advisory compensation had been structured as separate post-separation income, but payments originated from joint accounts prior to formal separation, acknowledgement, classification would not be clean. She exported the transaction history as a CSV file, then converted it into PDF format for preservation. At 6:38 a.m., her phone buzzed. An email from Eleanor Park's office. Miss Owens, Miss Park, is available at 9:30 a.m. today. Please confirm. Courtney replied immediately. Confirmed. Upstairs, she heard movement, Richard rising. She closed the banking portal but left her notebook open. When Richard entered the kitchen at 7:04 a.m., she was slicing fruit with deliberate calm. Morning, he said. Morning. He poured coffee, scrolling through his phone. Blake's pushing for press coordination, he said casually. Busy day. Courtney nodded. Of course. He glanced briefly at her notebook but did not comment. He had grown accustomed to her writing. He did not yet understand what she wrote. At 8:57 a.m., Courtney pulled into a modest office building on Kirby Drive. Eleanor Ellie Park's firm occupied the 3rd floor. No marble, no vaulted ceilings. Just clean lines, framed credentials, and quiet professionalism. Ellie greeted her personally. Mid-40s, measured eyes observant but not intrusive. Miss Owens, she said. Please come in. Courtney placed a slim leather folder on the conference table. I prefer Courtney, she replied. Ellie nodded. Tell me what's happening. Courtney did not dramatize. She outlined the sequence precisely. Acquisition execution at 10:28 a.m. Divorce petition filed at 3:17 p.m. Public acknowledgement secured that evening. Email coordination between corporate counsel and divorce attorney. Blackridge advisory compensation structure. Joint account payments. She slid the printed email chain across the table. Ellie read silently. Her expression did not change, but her posture sharpened slightly. Timing is not incidental here, Ellie said finally. No, Courtney agreed. Ellie tapped a finger lightly against the paper. If compensation is structured to fall outside community property by virtue of post-separation classification, but preparatory structuring occurred prior to filing, we may have grounds to challenge characterization. Courtney nodded once. There are also joint account transfers, she added, handing over the transaction summaries. Ellie reviewed them carefully. These are significant amounts. Yes. Did you consent to these transfers? I was not informed. Ellie leaned back. And the Blackridge entity formed prior to negotiation. Advisory compensation routed through it. Emails referenced minimizing marital exposure. Ellie exhaled slowly. This is not simply divorce, she said. It intersects corporate fiduciary obligations. Courtney remained composed. I'm aware. Ellie looked at her for a long moment. Are you seeking settlement or exposure? Courtney considered the question carefully. Process, she answered. Ellie nodded. Then we preserve everything. Immediately. They discussed litigation hold letters, formal discovery requests, preservation of electronic records. Ellie outlined next steps. File response challenging waiver validity under duress. Subpoena Blackridge financial disclosures. Request forensic accounting review of joint accounts. Notify corporate counsel of potential conflict. Courtney listened without interruption. No public statements, she added quietly. Ellie's gaze flicked upward. You don't want to leverage media now. Ellie studied her again. Why? Because evidence doesn't need amplification. Silence settled briefly between them. Ellie closed the folder. I'll retain a forensic accountant, she said. Marianne Soto. Discreet, thorough. Courtney nodded. As she rose to leave, Ellie added, Richard will escalate when he realizes the classification is contested. I know, Courtney replied. Back in her car, she sat for a moment before starting the engine. Escalation did not frighten her. Opacity did. At 11:16 a.m., Marianne Soto called. Her voice was steady, analytical. I've reviewed the transaction summaries Ellie forwarded, she said. I'll need full account access and corporate payment records. You'll have them, Courtney replied. There's something else, Marianne added. The timing of those Blackridge payouts suggests distribution triggered by closing event. Yes. If compensation was pre-negotiated and tied to execution, it may qualify as deferred marital asset. Courtney wrote deferred asset argument viable. She thanked Marianne and ended the call. At 12:02 p.m., a press release went live. Owens Energy Holdings announces landmark $45 billion strategic acquisition. Richard's name dominated the headline. Courtney's name appeared once listed as executive signatory. She read the release carefully. The advisory compensation structure was not mentioned. Blackridge Infrastructure Partners appeared only as integration facilitator. Language curated. She opened the acquisition agreement again. Schedule 4.3b remained confidential. Her phone vibrated with a message from Richard. Busy afternoon. Let's keep communications streamlined. No unnecessary complications. Courtney typed back, clarity is never unnecessary. She did not elaborate. That evening, Marianne emailed preliminary findings. Funds for Doyle retainer originated from joint account. Blackridge payouts linked to advisory allocation clause. Transfer dates align with execution and filing sequence. Courtney printed the report. Added it to the folder labeled Timeline Execution/Filing. She updated her notebook. Bank records confirm alignment. Advisory compensation structured to avoid marital classification. Evidence cumulative. Upstairs, Richard spoke on a televised panel about responsible growth and ethical leadership. Courtney watched from the living room. He spoke confidently about transparency. She turned off the television halfway through. Transparency, she knew, was measurable, and the bank had already measured it. Richard received Eleanor Park's notice of representation at 8:14 a.m. on a Thursday. Courtney knew the exact time because she was seated at the dining table when his phone vibrated sharply against the polished wood. He glanced down, expecting routine correspondence. Instead, his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. What is this? He asked, not looking at her. Courtney closed her notebook. It's my counsel, she replied evenly. Richard read the message again. The subject line was formal, notice of representation and request for preservation of evidence. He looked up slowly. You hired litigation counsel? Yes. For what? His tone remained measured, but the space between words narrowed. For process, she answered. He exhaled through his nose. This doesn't need to become adversarial. Courtney held his gaze. It already intersects corporate structuring. Silence expanded between them. Richard set his phone down. You're overreaching. I'm documenting. He studied her face carefully, searching for provocation. He found none. You're not in the boardroom anymore, he said. I was, she replied quietly, and I signed. His eyes sharpened. You signed willingly? Yes. And you acknowledged service? Yes. Then what exactly are you contesting? Courtney stood slowly, moving toward the kitchen island, where her laptop rested. Classification, she said. Richard's composure faltered just slightly. Of what compensation tied to Blackridge Infrastructure Partners? The name landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Richard's shoulders stiffened. That's corporate advisory, he said smoothly, not marital property. Emails suggest otherwise. He stared at her. What emails? She did not answer. Instead, she opened her laptop and rotated it toward him. Displayed on the screen was the preserved thread between Daniel Mercer and Patrick Doyle. Alignment. Minimize exposure. Post-separation classification. Richard's eyes scanned quickly. His face did not flush. He did not raise his voice. But the silence thickened. You accessed internal communications, he said quietly. I had access. You were not authorized to preserve privileged correspondence. I preserved what was sent to shared accounts and cross-referenced. Richard's voice cooled. You're playing a dangerous game. Courtney closed the laptop gently. I'm following the timeline. He paced once across the room, then back. This is corporate structuring, completely lawful. Then discovery will confirm that. He stopped moving. You're threatening discovery, I'm invoking it. For the first time since she had known him, Richard looked unsettled, and not dramatically, but in calculation. The variables had shifted. You realize, he said carefully, that litigation will expose everything. Courtney nodded. Yes. And you're comfortable with that, yes? Silence settled again. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms. This isn't about money, he said. No, she agreed. It's about sequence. He studied her more closely now. What do you want? Courtney considered the question carefully. Accurate classification, full disclosure, and correction of any mischaracterization. Richard's eyes narrowed. You think I engineered this? I think you aligned it. He did not deny it. Instead, he changed posture. Even if advisory compensation exists, it's performance-based. Triggered post-separation. It was negotiated pre-execution. That's irrelevant. It isn't. Their voices remained calm. That perhaps was what made the conversation heavier. Richard pushed off the counter. Daniel will handle any corporate inquiries, he said. Patrick will handle divorce. And Eleanor will handle both intersections, Courtney replied. His lips thinned. You've spoken to Daniel, no, but he's aware he will be. Richard checked his watch. I have a board call in 20 minutes. Courtney nodded. Of course. As he turned to leave the kitchen, he paused. This will escalate, he said quietly. Yes, she replied. Upstairs, Richard's voice carried faintly through the study door during the board call. Courtney did not listen for content. She organized. Eleanor had filed a formal response challenging the waiver of citation signed at St. Mark's, citing public pressure and insufficient disclosure at the time of acknowledgement. Marianne Soto had begun compiling a forensic accounting report. And at 11:47 a.m., Daniel Mercer's assistant called. Miss Owens, the assistant, said cautiously Mr. Mercer would like to schedule a conversation regarding document preservation. Of course, Courtney replied. The call took place at 2:00 p.m. Daniel's voice was measured. Courtney, we understand you've retained counsel. Yes. Certain internal communications may fall under attorney-client privilege. I understand privilege. Preserving corporate emails outside authorized channels could create complications. I preserved what was accessible to me within my rights as signatory. Daniel paused. There are broader implications here. For whom? She asked. Silence. We'd prefer to resolve this privately, he said. Then provide Schedule 4.3b, she replied. Another pause. That schedule contains confidential advisory allocations, allocated to whom Daniel did not answer directly. Its compensation tied to strategic facilitation. Facilitated by whom? He exhaled quietly. Courtney, escalating this could affect shareholders. Transparency protects shareholders, she said evenly. The call ended without resolution. At 4:18 p.m., Eleanor called. They're concerned, she said simply. I assumed they would be. Daniel hinted at corporate exposure. I'm aware. Ellie's tone softened slightly. Are you prepared for the pressure? Courtney looked toward the window where late afternoon lights slanted across the courtyard. Yes, she said. That evening, Richard returned home later than usual. He did not mention the board call. He did not mention Daniel. He poured himself a drink and stood at the window. "You could have walked away quietly," he said without turning around. Courtney stood several feet behind him. "I am walking," she replied. "Not like this. There isn't another path that preserves accuracy." He turned then. "You think I betrayed you. I think you sequenced advantage." He held her gaze. "Every executive protects position, and every spouse deserves disclosure." "Silence. You'll damage everything," he said softly. Courtney shook her head. "I'm documenting what already exists." He studied her one final time before heading upstairs. That night, Marianne sent updated analysis. Projected advisory allocation to Blackridge could exceed 8 figures over 5 years. Courtney read the figure without visible reaction. She wrote in her notebook, "Magnitude significant. Classification critical. Escalation imminent." Outside, the neighborhood lights dimmed automatically at 11:00 p.m. Inside, the house remained immaculate, unchanged. But beneath its quiet surfaces, alignment had fractured. And Richard, for the first time, was no longer certain he controlled the clock. The footage arrived in a secure download link at 7:32 a.m. on Monday. Courtney did not open it immediately. She forwarded the link to Eleanor Park, first copying Marianne Soto. Subject line, St. Markra. Event recording, 7:15, 7:25 p.m. Then she poured herself coffee and sat at the dining table where 4 days earlier she had signed the execution copy of a $45 billion agreement. The table looked the same. Marble did not register sequence. Her laptop chimed softly, Eleanor joining a secure call. "Let's review together," Ellie said. Courtney clicked the link. The screen displayed the interior of St. Mark's Civic Hall from a fixed angle mounted above the marble staircase. The camera captured the alcove where Richard had positioned her. The timestamp read, 1917-42. Guests moved in and out of frame. Richard entered from the left posture confident. Patrick Doyle followed portfolio in hand. Courtney stood near the staircase, hands folded. From above, the choreography was visible. Richard guided her subtly into the alcove, positioned himself between her and the open hall, protective to observers, directional in reality. Ellie spoke softly. "Zoom on their hands." Courtney enlarged the frame. Richard's fingers were visible at her elbow. The pressure was not violent. It was controlled. The timestamp advanced. 1918. 11. Patrick opened the portfolio. 1918-27. Richard leaned in. 1918-34. His mouth moved close to her ear. The footage had no audio, but Courtney remembered the words clearly. "You don't understand the legal implications anyway." Ellie paused the video. "Do we have audio anywhere?" she asked. "Voicemail," Courtney replied. "Not from that moment, but from later." "Send it." Courtney opened her phone and forwarded the saved voicemail file. It had been left by Richard at 6:58 p.m., moments before he approached her at the event. The transcript was brief. "Courtney, don't complicate this tonight. Just sign what Patrick gives you. We'll handle everything else later." Ellie listened twice. "Tone is instructive," she said quietly. Back on the footage, the moment of signature appeared. 1919-02. Courtney took the pen. 1919-14. She signed. 1919-18. Richard's posture relaxed. From above, his exhale was visible in the slight lowering of his shoulders. Ellie resumed speaking. "This supports a duress argument. Public setting, implied pressure, pre-filing coordination." Courtney nodded once. She did not look away from the screen. The footage continued. 1919-45. Megan Ellis moved slightly closer, observing. 1920-10. Two donors paused mid-conversation. Witnesses. Ellie saved still frames of key timestamps. "Chain of custody," she asked. "Requested formally through the event portal. Archived automatically." "Good." Courtney closed the video. Silence settled between them. "He believed the setting insulated him," Ellie said. "Yes," Courtney replied. "Sacred spaces amplified sound. But they also preserved sight." At 9:14 a.m., Marianne sent an updated memo. Subject: Blackridge Preliminary Compensation Modeling. The memo outlined projected advisory payouts tied to performance benchmarks over 5 years. Total potential allocation, $12.80, $18.4 million. Courtney read the figures carefully. Not for shock, for scale. Marianne's note included a single line, highlighted in yellow: if advisory agreement executed prior to marital separation, but structured to trigger post-filing classification, may be contested. Courtney printed the memo, added it to the growing folder labeled Timeline Execution, /Filing. At 11:02 a.m., Eleanor filed a motion challenging the validity of the waiver signed at St. Mark's, attaching still images from the footage and the voicemail transcript. By 1:30 p.m., Richard's attorney, Patrick Doyle, responded with an email. Subject: Objection to characterization. Patrick wrote, "Any assertion of duress is unfounded. Mrs. Owens signed voluntarily. No coercion occurred." Well, Courtney read the email without visible reaction. Voluntary. The word had been used before. At 2:17 p.m., Daniel Mercer requested an emergency call with Richard and outside corporate counsel. Courtney learned this from a forwarded board notice she still received by virtue of her signatory status. Subject: Special Session Risk Assessment. She did not attempt to join. Instead, she continued assembling. Emails preserved, bank records exported, advisory draft archived, security footage cataloged. At 4:02 p.m., Richard returned home earlier than usual. He entered the kitchen without removing his jacket. "You filed a motion," he said. "Yes." "You attached event footage." "Yes." His eyes sharpened. "You're framing a narrative. I'm presenting sequence." He placed both hands on the counter. "You signed willingly. I signed under pressure. There was no threat. There was implication." Richard's voice remained low. "You're damaging my credibility." Courtney met his gaze steadily. Credibility isn't damaged by scrutiny. He exhaled sharply. "Daniel's fielding inquiries. The board is concerned about what she asked. Exposure. Then disclose." Silence. He looked at her as if recalibrating who stood in front of him. "You think this is about leverage?" he said quietly. "No," she replied. "It's about accuracy." He stepped closer. "You have no idea what you're triggering?" "I do." The air between them felt compressed, but neither raised their voice. "You're risking the deal," he said. "If the deal withstands scrutiny, it will stand. And if it doesn't, then it shouldn't." Richard stared at her for several long seconds. "You're not the woman I married," he said finally. Courtney's expression did not change. "No," she agreed. He turned away first. That night, at 8:56 p.m., a formal notice arrived from Owens Energy Holdings outside counsel. Subject: Preservation Directive. The directive instructed all executives and related parties to preserve communications regarding Blackridge Infrastructure Partners and advisory allocations. Litigation hold. Courtney read the notice twice. The mechanism had shifted. What had been private sequencing was now formal procedure. Her phone buzzed. A message from Eleanor. "They're circling internally. Stay steady." Courtney replied, "I am." She walked upstairs and paused outside Richard's study. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, he sat at his desk, reviewing documents with visible tension beneath controlled posture. He did not see her. For the first time, the rhythm of his movement felt uncertain. Momentum, she thought, does not favor the loudest. It favors the prepared. She returned to her room and opened her notebook. 1919-14. Signature at St. Mark's S. Audio preserved. Motion filed. Litigation hold issued. She closed the notebook gently. Outside, the night air settled over the manicured courtyard. Inside, documentation had replaced assumption. And the footage above the marble staircase had captured more than a signature. It had captured intent. The announcement was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. Eastern. Owens Energy Holdings had coordinated with 3 national financial outlets and 2 energy trade publications. The embargo lifted precisely on the hour. Courtney knew because she had read the press coordination emails weeks earlier, before her access quietly narrowed. At 9:58 a.m., she sat alone in the living room. The television muted a financial news channel displaying a countdown ticker in the lower corner of the screen. Richard was not home. He had flown to New York the previous evening for a live interview segment. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the headline appeared, "Owens Energy finalizes $45 billion strategic acquisition." Richard's image filled the screen moments later, tailored suit-measured smile studio lighting, softening the lines at his temples. The anchor's voice, though muted, was familiar in rhythm. Courtney turned the volume up slightly. "A transformative moment for domestic infrastructure," the anchor was saying. "Mr. Owens, congratulations." Richard inclined his head modestly. "Thank you. This reflects months of disciplined negotiation and careful structuring." Careful structuring. Courtney watched without expression. On the screen behind Richard, a slide displayed key metrics, projected growth integration timeline, projected advisory oversight. There it was again, advisory oversight. The phrase had not appeared in earlier drafts. She opened her laptop and pulled up the final press release. Paragraph 5 referenced strategic advisory services provided through affiliated infrastructure partners. Affiliated, not named. Her email chimed. Marianne Soto. Subject: media language versus contract language. Marianne's message was concise. Public release references advisory oversight. Executed agreement references advisory compensation under Schedule 4.3b. Language discrepancy notable. Courtney wrote, "Public equals sign oversight. Contract equals sign compensation." At 10:17 a.m., her phone buzzed again. A text from Eleanor. "Board convening emergency review session at 2:00 p.m. Likely optics management." Courtney glanced back at the screen. Richard's interview had shifted tone. The anchor leaned forward. "There have been reports of internal litigation surrounding personal matters," she said carefully. "Does that impact the acquisition?" Richard's expression did not flicker. "Personal matters are separate and handled respectfully," he replied. "They have no bearing on corporate governance. No bearing." Courtney muted the television again. Her name had not been mentioned, but it did not need to be. At 11:04 a.m., an internal Owens Energy email, still accessible through her preserved archive, surfaced from Olivia Grant. Subject: narrative consistency. Key message: acquisition insulated from personal developments. Avoid referencing advisory compensation details publicly. Courtney read the final line twice. Avoid referencing advisory compensation details publicly. Her phone rang. Eleanor. "They're trying to firewall the narrative," Ellie said without preamble. "Yes," Courtney replied. "Have you decided whether you want to intervene at the corporate level?" Courtney considered. "What are the options? We can send a formal notice to the board, highlighting potential misalignment between public statements and executed agreements. That escalates beyond divorce." Courtney's gaze drifted toward the window. In the courtyard below, gardeners trimmed hedges with precise mechanical rhythm. "If the board is already reviewing," she said slowly, "they will find the discrepancy. Unless they're discouraged from looking," Ellie replied. Silence lingered. Courtney did not crave spectacle, but she understood omission. "Prepare the notice," she said finally. "Fact-based, no commentary. Understood." At 1:48 p.m., Richard called. His voice carried studio polish, but beneath it was strain. "You saw the interview," he said. "Yes, you've made this unnecessarily visible. I filed motions within legal process. You attached corporate references. They're intertwined. They don't need to be. They already are." Silence. "You're forcing scrutiny," he said. "Scrutiny ensures accuracy. You're jeopardizing shareholder confidence. Transparency preserves it." His breath tightened audibly. "This isn't about corporate governance," he said quietly. "It's about you and me." Courtney's voice remained steady. "If it were only about us, you wouldn't have coordinated timing." Another pause. "You're mischaracterizing intent. I'm documenting sequence." He lowered his voice further. "Daniel's under pressure. The board's asking questions about Blackridge. They should. You don't understand the consequences. I do. Richard exhaled sharply. You're pushing me into a corner. Courtney looked at the reflection of herself in the dark television screen. No, she said. I'm standing where the record places me. The call ended without resolution. At 2:12 p.m., Eleanor forwarded confirmation. Notice sent to Board of Directors, subject advisory compensation disclosure. Schedule 4.3b. The letter was precise. It outlined the timing of Blackridge's formation, the advisory allocation clause, the divorce filing sequence, and the potential misalignment between public narrative and executed documentation. No accusation, only chronology. At 3:05 p.m., Harold Whitman responded not to Courtney, but to Eleanor. The board acknowledges receipt. We are initiating internal review of advisory structures. Courtney read the message twice, initiating internal review. That evening, financial news outlets began circulating minor follow-up pieces. Owens Energy faces governance questions amid personal litigation. The tone was restrained, professional, curious. Richard returned home late that night. He entered without greeting. Courtney stood in the kitchen, notebook open. The board's reviewing Blackridge, he said flatly. Yes, you forced it. I provided context. He stared at her. You could have walked away with a settlement. I'm not negotiating silence. His jaw tightened. You think I was stealing from you. I think you were reclassifying. That's strategic planning. It's sequencing advantage. The words hung between them like exposed wiring. You're damaging everything we built, he said. Courtney met his gaze. What we built requires disclosure. He stepped closer. This will follow you. Documentation doesn't follow, she replied softly. It stands. Silence fell again. For a moment, something almost like doubt crossed his face, but it hardened quickly. You don't know how far this can go, he said. Courtney closed her notebook gently. I don't need to, she replied. I only need to know it's accurate. Upstairs, the house remained immaculate. Downstairs, beneath quiet lighting and polished stone, the narrative had shifted. The acquisition was no longer insulated. It was intersected. And Richard, for the first time since the execution at 10:28 a.m., no longer controlled which questions would be asked. Discovery did not arrive with drama. It arrived with numbered requests, interrogatories, requests for production, subpoenas narrowly tailored and precisely timed. Eleanor Park filed them on a Tuesday morning at 8:03 a.m., and by 9:15 a.m., Patrick Doyle had acknowledged receipt. Courtney sat at her desk reviewing the final versions before they were served. Each request was written without accusation. Each line relied on sequence. Request number 4. Produce all documents referencing Schedule 4.3b of the Acquisition and Strategic Integration Agreement. Request number 7. Produce communications between Daniel Mercer and Patrick Doyle concerning timing of marital filings in relation to acquisition execution. Request no. 11. Produce formation documents and ownership disclosures for Blackridge Infrastructure Partners, LLC. Ellie had warned her. They will resist, she said. Delay, redact, reframe. Courtney nodded. Paper resists quietly, she replied. So do I. By Wednesday afternoon, the first response arrived. Objection. Privileged. Irrelevant. Overbroad. Courtney read the objections carefully, not for their language, but for what they avoided. Schedule 4.3b was referenced, but not produced. Blackridge ownership listed as wholly owned subsidiary, no individual beneficial owners named. Timing communications partially redacted. She printed each objection. Labeled them, objection pattern. At 2:42 p.m., Marianne Soto called. They're classifying Blackridge as operational advisory, she said. But the compensation modeling doesn't align with operational benchmarks. Explain, Courtney replied. The payout structure is front-loaded around closing milestones, not long-term advisory metrics. Courtney wrote front-loaded, closing triggered. That weakens post-separation argument. Marianne continued. If compensation is tied to pre-filing execution, event classification becomes contested. Document it, Courtney said. I am. That evening, Richard returned home later than usual. He did not enter through the front door. He came in through the garage entrance, quiet but deliberate. Courtney heard the door close. She remained seated at the dining table, laptop open, discovery responses spread in neat stacks. He approached slowly. They're requesting corporate formation documents, he said without greeting. Yes. You've crossed into corporate governance. No, she replied calmly. Your structuring crossed into marital classification. He placed his briefcase on the counter with controlled force. You're using divorce as leverage against the company. I'm using divorce to request disclosure. The board is not pleased. Transparency rarely pleases. Richard studied her face for signs of hostility. He found none. You think they'll side with you? He asked. I think they'll side with facts. Silence lingered. He moved closer to the table, scanning the printed objections. They're within their rights to assert privilege. And I'm within mine to challenge scope. He exhaled sharply. You're not going to stop. No, he straightened. You're risking reputational harm. Courtney closed her laptop gently. Reputation survives scrutiny, she said. The following morning, Eleanor filed a motion to compel production of Schedule 4.3b, citing relevance to asset classification and timing. Attached to the motion were email excerpts referencing marital exposure, transaction summaries showing Blackridge payouts, timeline of execution and filing. No commentary, only chronology. At 11:12 a.m., Harold Whitman emailed Daniel Mercer, copying outside counsel. Subject, clarification required, advisory structure. Courtney saw the email hours later through preserved board correspondence. Harold's tone was measured but firm. The board requires confirmation that advisory compensation does not create undisclosed conflict or fiduciary exposure. Fiduciary exposure. The phrase shifted the axis. Richard called at 1:38 p.m. His voice was quieter than usual. The board wants full disclosure on Blackridge, he said. That's appropriate, Courtney replied. You've triggered internal review. You structured it. He did not argue. Instead, he asked a different question. What do you actually want? Courtney paused. Accurate classification, she said again. He sighed. You could have negotiated quietly. I still can, she replied. With disclosure, silence. You're dismantling alignment, he said. Alignment built on omission collapses. He did not respond. That afternoon, Marianne delivered a formal forensic memorandum. The memo outlined 3 critical points Blackridge formation preceded negotiation timeline. Advisory compensation modeled as closing triggered. Divorce filing executed within hours of acquisition signing. The conclusion was restrained, but clear sequence suggests strategic timing affecting asset classification. Courtney read the memo once, then placed it in the folder labeled Discovery Phase 1. At 4:50 p.m., Patrick Doyle emailed Eleanor. We are willing to produce limited portions of Schedule 4.3b under protective order. Limited portions. Ellie called immediately. They're conceding partial relevance, she said. Not full, Courtney replied. No, Ellie agreed. But it's movement. Courtney looked toward the window. Clouds gathered low over the Houston skyline. Momentum, she thought, was shifting, not through confrontation, but through compulsion. Paper had forced acknowledgement. That evening, Richard did not come home. He texted at 9:14 p.m., staying at hotel tonight. Courtney responded, understood. She sat alone in the quiet house reviewing the partial production that arrived at 10:22 p.m. Schedule 4.3b redacted version. Entire sections blacked out, but not everything. A line remained visible. Managing Advisory Allocation RO subject to performance benchmarks. RO Richard Owens. Her pen hovered above the notebook. She wrote slowly, allocation directly to RO closing triggered. Redactions indicate concealment. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt confirmation. At 11:37 p.m., Eleanor emailed again. Will challenge redactions. Court likely to compel full disclosure. Courtney closed her notebook. Discovery had begun as numbered requests. It was becoming narrative. Not dramatic, not explosive, methodical. Richard had believed alignment would protect him. But alignment documented becomes evidence. And evidence once compelled does not retreat. The hearing was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. on a Thursday. No cameras were permitted inside the courtroom. No live feeds. No microphones angled for commentary. The room was smaller than the rotunda at St. Mark's and less ornate than the boardrooms Richard preferred. Justice in this setting relied on record rather than resonance. Courtney arrived at 8:37 a.m. dressed in charcoal gray hair pulled back neatly. She carried no briefcase, only a slim folder and her notebook. Eleanor Parks stood beside her at counsel table reviewing final notes. Across the aisle, Richard sat beside Patrick Doyle. He wore a navy suit and the same composure he had worn during the televised interview announcing the acquisition. He did not look at Courtney. She did not look at him. The judge entered at 9:02 a.m. The hearing concerned two matters: the validity of the waiver signed at St. Mark's and the motion to compel production of unredacted Schedule 4.3b. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only sequence. Patrick spoke first. "Your Honor, Mrs. Owens signed acknowledgement voluntarily. There was no coercion. Furthermore, corporate advisory agreements are irrelevant to marital classification." He spoke cleanly, measured. Eleanor rose next. "Your Honor, the issue before the court is not corporate governance. It is timing and classification. Evidence demonstrates coordination between acquisition execution and marital filing, potentially affecting asset characterization." She approached the bench with a small stack of documents. Exhibits entered into Record Exhibit A email thread referencing minimized marital exposure. Exhibit B bank transfer summaries showing Blackridge payouts. Exhibit C security footage still frames from St. Mark's Civic Hall. Exhibit D partial production of Schedule 4.3b. The judge reviewed each briefly before nodding for presentation. Eleanor began with Exhibit C, the still frame from 1918-34. Richard leaning close, hand at Courtney's elbow. Public setting visible in background. "Your Honor," Eleanor said calmly, "the waiver was signed in a public venue under observable pressure hours after a multi-billion-dollar transaction was executed." The voicemail entered as Exhibit E reinforces implied coercion. Patrick objected. Speculation regarding coercion. Overruled, the judge said simply, "The court will consider context." Courtney sat still, hands folded, eyes steady. Patrick rose again. "The advisory agreement is privileged corporate information. It bears no relevance to dissolution." Eleanor responded immediately. "The agreement bears directly on compensation tied to closing. Compensation negotiated pre-filing but structured to trigger post-filing." She handed up Marianne Soto's forensic memorandum. The judge read the highlighted conclusion. Silence stretched for several seconds. Patrick shifted slightly. "The structuring is lawful. Lawful structuring does not negate classification review," Eleanor replied. The judge looked toward Richard. "Mr. Owens," she said, "does Schedule 4.3b allocate advisory compensation directly to you?" Richard stood. "Yes, Your Honor." "And was that advisory allocation negotiated prior to the filing of dissolution?" Patrick interjected. "Objection, relevance." "Overruled," the judge said. Richard hesitated briefly. "It was part of strategic planning prior to closing." "Prior to filing, yes. And triggered upon closing, yes." The courtroom remained quiet. Courtney felt no surge of emotion, only clarity. The judge turned back to the bench. "Given the sequence and partial production, the court grants the motion to compel. Unredacted Schedule 4.3b shall be produced within 7 days." Patrick's jaw tightened. "And regarding the waiver?" he asked. The judge reviewed Exhibit C once more. The public nature of the signing, combined with contemporaneous filing and limited disclosure, raises sufficient concern. The waiver is set aside. Mrs. Owens is granted full response period. The words were delivered without emphasis. No drama, but the axis shifted. Courtney closed her eyes briefly. Not in relief, in acknowledgement. Richard remained standing. His expression did not fracture. But the control he had assumed in St. Mark's had dissolved quietly under fluorescent courtroom lights. After adjournment, Richard approached her in the hallway. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I know," Courtney replied. "You've escalated." I followed sequence. He searched her face for anger. There was none, only steadiness. "You could have settled," he said. "I still can," she replied. "With disclosure." He exhaled slowly. "You don't understand corporate consequence. I understand documentation." Patrick stepped beside him. "We'll comply under protest," he said to Eleanor. Ellie nodded. "That's sufficient." Outside the courthouse, the Texas heat pressed heavily against stone steps. Reporters waited at a distance, aware of the hearing but lacking details. No statements were made. Courtney descended the steps without pause. Richard remained at the top for a moment longer, speaking quietly to Patrick. For the first time, his posture was not expansive. It was contained. By 4:18 p.m., the Board of Owens Energy received formal notice of the court's order, compelling full disclosure of Schedule 4.3b. Harold Whitman emailed immediately. "Full transparency required. Provide unredacted copy to board and outside counsel." Daniel Mercer replied within minutes. "Understood." Courtney did not celebrate. She returned home and placed the hearing transcript into her growing binder. Notebook entry waiver voided. Schedule compelled. Sequence acknowledged in court. She underlined the final phrase, "Sequence acknowledged." At 7:06 p.m., Richard returned home. He did not remove his jacket. "The board will see everything he said. Yes, they're questioning fiduciary optics. Then clarify them." He studied her again. "You're not angry?" "No." Then why? Courtney closed her notebook gently. Because timing was intentional. Silence filled the space between them. "You think I tried to erase you," he said. "I think you tried to outpace me." He did not deny it. Upstairs, the house remained immaculate. Downstairs, under soft recessed lighting, the record had spoken. Not loudly, but clearly. And in a courtroom where marble did not amplify applause, sequence had outweighed performance. The unredacted schedule. 4.3b arrived at 8:16 a.m. the following Tuesday. It was transmitted under protective order, encrypted, and marked confidential court compelled disclosure. Courtney did not open it immediately. She forwarded it to Eleanor Park and Marianne Soto first, then waited for confirmation that both had accessed the file. At 8:24 a.m., Eleanor called. "I'm opening it now," she said. Courtney opened her copy as well. The redactions were gone. Black text replaced black bars. The document was precise, methodical, and unambiguous. Managing Advisory Allocation, Richard Owens. Compensation Trigger Execution of Acquisition Agreement. Initial allocation, $6.5 million upon closing. Subsequent performance-based allocation structured over 24 months. Entity Vehicle Blackridge Infrastructure Partners, LLC. Courtney read each line slowly. There was no dramatic revelation, only clarity. The initial allocation, $6. $5 million had been triggered at the moment of closing. 10:28 a.m. The same minute her name had been written across the execution page. Marianne joined the call. "This language is definitive," she said calmly. "The trigger event is execution, not post-separation performance." Eleanor agreed. "And it was negotiated before filing." "Yes," Courtney said. Silence lingered briefly between them. "It's not just classification anymore," Eleanor added. "This raises fiduciary disclosure issues at the corporate level." Courtney looked at the timestamp in the document header. Drafted 3 weeks prior to execution. Revised 2 days before. Pre-filing, pre-separation, pretense of insulation. She opened her notebook. 10:28 a.m. signature. Trigger event identical. Allocation direct. She underlined identical. At 9:12 a.m., Eleanor sent a formal notice to Patrick Doyle and copied corporate counsel. Subject advisory compensation material disclosure concern. The notice outlined. Trigger timing aligned with execution event. negotiation timeline preceding marital filing, potential mischaracterization in public communications, no accusation, only alignment of fact. By 10:03 a.m., Harold Whitman convened another emergency board session. Courtney did not attend. But through preserved correspondence and formal notices, she understood the direction. At 11:47 a.m., Daniel Mercer emailed outside counsel. Board requires immediate review of Blackridge advisory structure for conflict of interest exposure. Conflict of interest exposure. The phrase carried more weight than marital classification. At 1:15 p.m., Richard called. He did not begin with accusation this time. You've seen it, he said. Yes. He exhaled slowly. It's standard executive incentive. It's closing triggered. That's common. It wasn't disclosed publicly. It wasn't required. It is now. Silence. The board's reviewing my position, he said quietly. Courtney did not respond immediately. Were they aware of the allocation structure before execution, she asked. They approved strategic compensation frameworks. Did they see Schedule 4.3b? Another pause. They saw summaries, not the trigger language. Richard did not answer. That was answer enough. You've made this irreversible, he said. No, she replied. The language did. He inhaled sharply. You could have kept this confined to divorce. You structured it beyond that. The call ended without escalation. At 3:08 p.m., Marianne sent a supplementary analysis. Her memo outlined how the advisory allocation, if undisclosed fully to the board and shareholders, could constitute material omission depending on governance standards. The language was cautious, but the implication was clear. Courtney printed it, added it to the binder. At 4:22 p.m., a statement from Owens Energy Holdings was released. Owens Energy initiates internal governance review of advisory compensation structures. The tone was restrained, measured, but the shift was undeniable. Richard returned home after dark. He entered without the confidence he once carried. Courtney stood in the kitchen, the binder closed on the counter. The board is forming an independent committee, he said. Yes. They're reviewing executive compensation disclosures. That's appropriate. He looked at her, not angry now, not defensive. Just calculating consequence. You've jeopardized my position. I preserved sequence. He walked toward the window, hands in his pockets. They're asking whether I disclosed Blackridge fully. Did you? I disclosed framework, not trigger language. He did not respond. The silence stretched. They're considering suspension pending review, he said finally. Courtney felt no satisfaction, only inevitability. This didn't have to become public, he added. It became documented. He turned toward her. You think I intended harm. I think you intended advantage. And you think that justifies this. I think documentation justifies review. He studied her one final time. You won't gloat, he said quietly. No, she replied. I know you. Yes, she agreed. That night at 9:37 p.m., an official board notice was circulated. Effective immediately, Richard Owens will step aside from executive duties pending independent review of advisory compensation disclosures. Courtney read the notice once, then closed her laptop. Upstairs, the house remained pristine. Downstairs, consequence had arrived without spectacle, not through exposure in headlines, but through compelled clarity. At 10:12 p.m., Eleanor called. This shifts leverage, she said. I'm not seeking leverage. I know, Ellie replied, but it shifts it. Courtney sat quietly for a moment. What happens next, she asked. Review, findings, potential renegotiation of compensation, and your divorce proceeds under full disclosure. Courtney nodded. After the call ended, she opened her notebook one last time that evening. Schedule unredacted. Trigger confirmed. Board action initiated. She paused, then wrote, no humiliation required. Because humiliation had never been her objective. Sequence had been. Richard had believed momentum protected him, but momentum collapses when examined under light. And in a house built on clean lines and curated surfaces, documentation had finally disrupted the image. Courtney closed the notebook gently. The clock above the stove read 11:03 p.m. The hour was quiet, but the structure had shifted. And this time, not in his favor. The independent review took 23 days. No press conferences, no dramatic leaks. Just formal statements issued at measured intervals and board meetings held behind closed doors. Courtney did not attend any of them. She did not need to. By the fourth day, Richard had moved into a downtown condominium leased under the company's transitional executive housing policy. By the 12th, the independent committee had requested additional documentation regarding Blackridge's formation and advisory negotiation drafts. By the 19th day, outside counsel had recommended compensation restructuring pending full governance review. And on the 23rd day, the board released a final statement. Owens Energy Holdings announces executive leadership transition. The language was careful. Richard Owens would resign as CEO effective immediately. He would remain available during transition but relinquish operational control. The advisory compensation under review would be renegotiated and disclosed in amended filings. No accusation, no admission of wrongdoing. But the position he had built meticulously strategically was no longer his. Courtney read the statement alone in the quiet living room. She did not turn on the television. She did not call Eleanor. She did not text Marianne. She simply closed her laptop and sat for a moment listening to the soft hum of the house. Momentum had reversed, not explosively, quietly. Later that afternoon, Eleanor called. "The divorce proceeding will move into settlement discussions," she said. "Full financial disclosure has been provided. Classification of the initial Blackridge allocation will be treated as marital asset." Courtney nodded. "That's appropriate. You're entitled to a significant share." "I understand." There was a pause on the line. "You're not asking for public acknowledgement," Eleanor said. "No. Or apology. No." Why Courtney looked toward the window where late sunlight warmed the stone courtyard. "Because correction is sufficient," she replied. "Settlement negotiations lasted less than 2 weeks. Under revised terms, the $6.5 million initial advisory allocation was included in marital property. Future performance-based compensation would be disclosed and subject to structured division. The marital home would be sold. Assets divided equitably. Non-disparagement clauses applied mutually. Mutually. Courtney insisted on that. When the final agreement was presented for signature, there was no public alcove, no marble staircase, no onlookers. Just a conference room at Eleanor's office. Richard arrived 5 minutes early. He looked thinner, not diminished, just altered. Courtney entered without hesitation. They sat across from each other at a rectangular table. The final dissolution agreement rested between them. Richard spoke first. "You could have destroyed me," he said quietly. Courtney considered the statement. "I didn't," she replied. "You had enough. I had documentation." Silence lingered. "I thought I was protecting position," he said. "You were protecting advantage." He nodded faintly. "That cost me." "Yes." The acknowledgement was not dramatic. It was factual. They signed. No hesitation, no pressure, no performance. When it was finished, Richard extended his hand. Courtney looked at it for a moment before shaking it once. Measured, civil, final. She returned to the house one last time 2 days later to collect the remainder of her belongings. The home had already been staged for sale, art minimized, personal traces removed. She moved through each room slowly. Her study was nearly empty. Only the desk remained. She opened the second drawer and retrieved her leather-bound notebook. The first entry, March 14th. Interrupted twice. Phrase used allergic to the spotlight. She flipped through pages filled with dates, timestamps, phrases, sequences. Not anger, not vengeance. Record. She closed it gently and placed it in her bag. In the bedroom, her wedding ring rested in a small porcelain dish on the dresser. She picked it up, held it for a moment, then left it on the dresser. No speech, no ceremony, just placement. At the front door, She paused briefly, looking back at the immaculate interior, clean lines, curated surfaces, symmetrical design. Image. Then she stepped outside. The air felt warmer than usual. Her car waited at the curb. No reporters, no witnesses, just departure. Weeks later, the sale of the house closed quietly. Courtney relocated to a smaller home in Austin, closer to legal circles, farther from Houston's energy corridors. She accepted a consulting role specializing in corporate compliance review. Not public-facing, not spotlighted, precise. One evening, months after the dissolution was finalized, she received a brief email from Harold Whitman. Subject, appreciation. Courtney. Your insistence on disclosure prompted necessary review. Governance reforms underway. Harold. She read it once, then archived it. No reply necessary. Richard's name appeared occasionally in industry news, referenced as former CEO during transitional commentary. He did not issue statements about the divorce. Neither did she, because there was nothing left to clarify. The record had spoken, and once spoken, it did not need amplification. On a quiet Sunday morning, Courtney sat at her kitchen table in Austin sunlight, filtering through uncurated windows. Her notebook lay open in front of her, not to record wrongdoing, but to outline a new consulting framework she was developing. A system for identifying sequence risk in executive compensation structures. She wrote at the top of the page, "Integrity survives documentation." Then beneath it, "Silence is not absence. Observation is not weakness. Sequence reveals intention." She closed the notebook. The past had not been erased. It had been corrected. She rose from the table and stepped onto the small back porch. No vaulted ceilings, no marble, no cameras, just open air. She had not humiliated him. She had not exposed him publicly beyond necessity. She had not raised her voice. She had documented. And when the time came, she had walked away. Not triumphant, not bitter, simply intact. In a world that often confuses volume with strength, it is easy to overlook the quiet work of documentation. The patient recording of dates. The preservation of emails. The insistence that sequence matters. Courtney did not win by shouting. She did not reclaim dignity by humiliation. She did not dismantle power through spectacle. She allowed process to unfold. And when the truth aligned with the record, it stood on its own. If this story resonated with you, if you believe integrity does not need noise, take a moment to reflect on where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Stories of quiet strength travel farther than we realize. If you value narratives rooted in realism, legal process, and dignity without revenge, you're welcome to stay. There are more stories where silence carries weight. No pressure, just presence.